Before the name Persia was born, there was a land of contrasts, scorched by the sun and frozen by frost. See it in your mind's eye. From the west, it backs Mesopotamia like an impenetrable wall. These are the Zagros Mountains, stone dragons whose folded backs reach into the clouds. Their gorges are arteries through which life and death have flowed for millennia. Their peaks have been seen by all. To the east, this land crumbles into the dust of salt marshes, into silent deserts where the wind sings the lonely song of eternity. This is the Iranian plateau, a harsh cauldron in which nations were melted. Long before Persian was spoken here, Elam flourished in the hot valley to the southwest. Its capital, Susa, was ancient, back when Athens was still a shepherd's village. The Elamites built ziggurats, worshipped their gods, and fought the kings of Sumer and Akkad. They were the first great power of this land. But their time was passing. Around 1500 years BC, a great movement began from the north, from the steppes. Slow as the melting of a glacier, but just as inexorable. Waves of tribes, speaking related Aryan languages, sought new pastures for their herds. They were not a unified army of conquerors, they were clans, families, nomads whose greatest wealth was the horse and the bull. They brought with them their gods of sky and fire, their myths and their stern code of honor. Two of these tribal alliances lingered on the western slopes of the Zagros Mountains. History has remembered their names. In the north, the Medes, or Madai, as their neighbors called them, settled. Further south, in the land that would one day be called Parsa, the Persians, or Parsua, settled. Cousins by blood and language, but rivals in fate. In those centuries, in the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BCE, they were mere shadows on the political map. True power, brutal and absolute, belonged to others. It emanated from the west, from Mesopotamia. Assyria. The name was whispered. The Assyrian Empire was the most sophisticated military machine of its time. Its kings didn't just rule, they inspired terror. Their cuneiform accounts carved on stone slabs are not dry chronicles, they are hymns of ruthlessness. I burned their cities, I flayed the skin of their leaders and covered their walls with it. I built mountains from their heads. From Nineveh, from Asher, from the lion's den stretching along the Tigris, came a will carved in stone. A will that demanded tribute. Every year caravans marched west, laden not just with gold or grain, but with fear. The finest horses from the Iranian pastures, tall youths for service in the Assyrian army, submission. Median and Persian leaders paid this tribute. They knew the price of disobedience. Assyrian punitive expeditions were swift and merciless. The Zagros Mountains were not always a defense, but constant pressure breeds resistance. It was among the Median tribes, disunited and warring among themselves, that a desire for unity began to brew. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us a story, perhaps legendary, but nevertheless capturing the essence of this process. Among the Median people lived a man named Deiotis. He was known for his impeccable honesty. Neighbors came to him to settle disputes, and his judgments were always fair. Soon his fame spread throughout the Median villages. People stopped going to their leaders and went only to Deiotis. Seeing that all power had been concentrated in his hands, Deiotis declared himself tired and would no longer administer justice. Chaos and lawlessness reigned in the Median lands. And then the desperate tribes gathered in council and decided, we need a king. And they chose the only man they trusted, Deiotis. Thus, according to legend, the Median kingdom was born through cunning and wisdom, and not by the sword. The historical reality was likely far more prosaic and bloodier. The leaders united in the face of the Assyrian threat. Deos's son, Phraortes, had already launched an open challenge to Assyria, but was defeated and killed. It seemed the Assyrian lion had triumphed once again. But then Cyaxares ascended the Median throne. He was a leader of a different kind. He realized that the old tribal militias were powerless against the iron cohorts of Assyria. He reorganized the army along Assyrian lines, creating separate units of spearmen, archers, and cavalry. He turned shepherds into soldiers. And he found allies. In the south, in Babylon, a new king, Nabopolassar, arose, also eager to throw off the Assyrian yoke. Two streams of hatred merged into one. In 614 BC, the Medes stormed Ashur, the ancient religious capital of Assyria. But the main prize was yet to come: Nineveh, the greatest city in the world, surrounded by impenetrable walls. For 2 years, the combined armies of the Medes and Babylonians besieged the lion's den. Chronicles are silent on the details of this siege, but we can imagine the roar of battering rams, the whistle of arrows, and the desperate sorties of the doomed defenders. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. The city, which had plundered the world for centuries, was given over to plunder. It was burned to the ground, its inhabitants massacred or carried off into slavery. The prophets of the Old Testament, who foretold the destruction of the bloody city, were proven correct. The Assyrian Empire, that colossus that had held the entire Middle East in fear, collapsed. From its ruins, a new world arose. And in this new world, Media became the dominant power in the East. Cyaxares and his successor, Astyages, ruled a vast empire, stretching from central Anatolia to the borders of Iran. They built their capital at Ecbatana in the cool of the mountains. They enjoyed the fruits of their victory. And what of the Persians? They were there. They fought in the ranks of the Median army, loyal vassals of their more powerful kinsmen. Their Achaemenid kings swore allegiance to the Median overlord and lived quietly in their mountainous province of Parsa. They were in the shadows. But to the south, in the shadow of Median grandeur, another lineage was quietly amassing strength. The line of Achaemenes. Their time had not yet come, but it was approaching with the inevitability of the seasons. In the mid-6th century BC, the world as we knew it rested on the power of ancient empires, power forged in the fire and blood of generations. In Media, in his capital, Ecbatana, a city of 7 walls, each painted the color of a planet, reigned King Astyages. He was the ruler of a mighty confederation, the master of a fearsome cavalry, and his word was law from the Zagros mountains to the Halis river. But old kings often have troubled dreams. And Astyages had a dream as cold as a snake slithering under the blanket. He saw a vine sprout from his daughter's womb, its shoots entwining and shading all of Asia. The sages and magicians who interpreted the dreams were unanimous. Astyages' grandson, the son of his daughter Mandane, would threaten his throne. This grandson was Cyrus, ruler of Anshan, a Persian vassal kingdom on the dusty plains of the south. For Astyages, he was merely a pawn, a distant relative obliged to pay tribute and supply warriors, but the spark of rebellion was already smouldering. This was more than a simple revolt of vassal against overlord. It was a family drama played out on the map of the ancient world. Grandfather versus grandson. The old order versus the new power. In 550 BC, Cyrus raised the banner of rebellion. Astyages, enraged and overconfident, gathered his vast army and marched south to teach the insolent Persian a lesson. The initial battles were desperate. The Persian infantry, outnumbered and outgunned, fought to the death, defending their land. But the decisive event occurred not on the battlefield, but in the tent of a Median commander. His name was Harpagus, the man whose loyalty Astyages had once destroyed with unimaginable cruelty, forcing him to eat his own son. Harpagus's betrayal was nurtured by a terrible oath of vengeance sworn many years earlier. In the midst of the final battle, he and a significant portion of the Median army defected to Cyrus. Astyages' army crumbled. He fled to Ecbatana, but the city fell. And here Cyrus did something no one expected. The world had become accustomed to a different scenario. The victor was expected to raze the capital to the ground, blind, or execute the captive king and enslave his people. That's what the Assyrians did. That's what the Babylonians did. But Cyrus acted differently. He preserved Ecbatana. He spared the life of his grandfather Astyages, keeping him at court as an honorary advisor. He didn't humiliate the Median nobility. Instead, he offered them an alliance. He united the Persians and the Medes, creating a dual monarchy, where yesterday's enemies became partners in building a new, unprecedented power. This was the foundation stone of the Achaemenid Empire. Favor, not the sword, became his chief weapon. But the fall of Media upset the fragile balance of power. To the west, beyond the Halys River, lay the wealthy kingdom of Lydia. Its ruler, Croesus, whose name became synonymous with immeasurable wealth, looked anxiously to the east. The sudden rise of the Persian upstart threatened his own power. Seeking to know his fate, Croesus sent generous gifts to the Greek sanctuaries and the Delphic oracle. The Pythian priestess's reply went down in history as a model of ambiguity. If King Croesus crosses the Halys River, he will crush a great empire. Certain that he was speaking of Cyrus's empire, Croesus gathered an army and crossed the river. The first battle at Tyria was inconclusive. With the onset of winter, the Lydian king disbanded his mercenaries, believing that military action would be postponed until spring. This was a fatal mistake. Cyrus did not recognize the rules of seasonal warfare. He made a swift advance across the snow-covered plateaus of Anatolia and appeared at the walls of the Lydian capital, Sardis, when he was least expected. The two armies clashed on the plain before the city. Croesus's main strength was his magnificent cavalry, considered the finest in Asia. But Cyrus had a surprise. On the advice of that same Harpagus, he placed all the camels in his baggage train at the front of his army. The Lydian horses, unable to bear the sight and the acrid, unfamiliar smell of these animals, turned in panic and fled. The Lydian army was routed. After a brief siege, the impregnable walls of Sardis fell. Croesus, the richest man in the world, was captured. A great empire had truly been crushed. His own. Cyrus ordered a huge funeral pyre built, and the captive king and 14 Lydian youths placed upon it. The flames were already licking the damp wood when Croesus, looking up at the grey sky, uttered one name 3 times. Solon, Solon, Solon. Intrigued, Cyrus demanded an explanation. Croesus told him the story of his encounter with the Athenian sage Solon, who had once told him that no man can be called happy until his death, for the wheel of fortune is fickle. Hearing this, Cyrus suddenly saw his own fate reflected in Croesus's. He, today's victor, could find himself in his place tomorrow. He ordered the fire extinguished immediately. He saved Croesus, treated him with respect, and made him his advisor. In just a few years, Cyrus had transformed himself from the ruler of a small vassal kingdom into the master of vast territories. He was more than just a conqueror. He was a gatherer of lands and peoples. He demonstrated to the world a new style of governance, one in which wisdom and mercy were valued no less than military prowess. He had not yet conquered Babylon, had not yet reached the peak of his power, but he had already earned the titles that his descendants would repeat after him: King of Kings, Shahanshah, and the title of the ancient Mesopotamian rulers which now rightfully belonged to him, King of the Four Directions. Legacy is both a gift and a curse. For Cambyses Teku, son of Cyrus the Great, his father's shadow stretched longer than the entire Persian Empire. Cyrus was the founder, the liberator, almost a myth. Cambyses was simply his son, and he yearned to prove himself worthy of the scepter he held. His gaze was fixed south on the ancient, unconquered land of the pharaohs. Egypt, the last great prize that had eluded his father. In 525 BC, the Persian army marched west. The sands of Sinai crunched beneath the warriors' teeth, and ahead of them lay a 1,000-year-old civilization, confident in its gods and its own impregnability. But the gods of Egypt remained silent. At the Battle of Pelusium, Persian cunning overcame Egyptian courage. Memphis, the ancient capital, fell. Cambyses entered the conquered city not as a liberator like his father in Babylon, but as a conqueror. He assumed the double crown of the pharaoh, but this crown seemed forged from pure poison. Rule over Egypt brought him no peace. On the contrary, it ignited the flame of paranoia that had always smoldered within him. He saw conspiracies in every corner, treason in the eyes of his most loyal servants. He ruled not by law, but by fear. But his most terrible deed was committed before he ever set foot on Egyptian soil. Secretly, in the deepest secrecy, Cambyses had a younger brother, Bardia. He was popular among the people and the nobility, possessing the same charisma as their great father. For the suspicious Cambyses, this popularity was not a source of pride, but a mortal threat. Before his expedition to Egypt, he gave an order that changed everything. Bardia was to die, quietly, without witnesses. The executors did their job, and the empire continued to live, unaware that one of Cyrus's sons already lay in an unmarked grave. The truth had been buried, but the dead sometimes return. While Cambyses was descending into madness on the banks of the Nile, news of his cruelty and prolonged absence reached the heart of the empire. Discontent grew like weeds after rain. And at this moment, a man named Gaumata appeared on the historical stage. He was a Median magician and priest. And he possessed one striking quality. He was the spitting image of the murdered Prince Bardia. Gaumata knew a secret known only to a handful of people at court. He knew the real Bardia was dead, and he made a gamble, the audacity of which staggers the imagination. In the spring of 522 BC, he declared himself to be that very Bardia, the son of Cyrus, who had miraculously escaped the assassins of his cruel brother. The empire believed him. From India to the Aegean, cities and provinces swore allegiance to the impostor. He was everything Cambyses was not. He abolished taxes for 3 years and stopped military levies. He gave the people hope. He was the ideal ruler because he was an illusion. When news of the rebellion reached Cambyses in Syria, he was furious. He gathered his most trusted nobles and, with tears in his eyes, confessed to a terrible sin. He told them that he had personally ordered his brother's murder many years ago. That the man sitting on the throne in Susa was a deceiver, a magician who had stolen not only power, but also the face of a dead man. And here the greatest irony occurred. No one believed him. His confession of fratricide was dismissed as nothing more than the desperate lie of a tyrant trying to discredit a popular rival. The truth, spoken by a madman, sounded like a lie. Cambyses found himself trapped in his own secret. his greatest sin became his greatest defeat. His end was as dark and absurd as his reign. While gathering an army to attack the usurper, he, according to one version, accidentally stabbed himself in the thigh with his own sword. The wound was in the exact same spot where, according to legend, he struck the sacred Apis bull in Egypt. Infection set in. The great king, son of Cyrus, conqueror of Egypt, died of gangrene in a small Syrian town, realizing that his empire was now in the hands of a phantom he himself had created. He died, and his last word was likely a curse. Gaumata's power seemed absolute, but whispers in the cool corridors of the palaces continued. 7 of the most distinguished Persian aristocrats began to suspect something was wrong. One of them, named Otanes, found a way to test his suspicions. His daughter was in the new king's harem. Otanes knew that the magician Gaumata's ears had been cut off many years earlier for some crime. He gave his daughter a secret order. While the king slept, she was to touch his head under cover of darkness and determine whether his ears were still there. One night, when the entire palace was asleep, a girl's trembling hand slipped beneath the royal tiara. Her heart was pounding. She felt the smooth skin where her ears should have been. There were no ears. The next day, Otanes gathered 6 more conspirators. Among them was a young, energetic, and ambitious aristocrat from a cadet branch of the Achaemenid family. His name was Darius. There was no longer any doubt. An impostor sat on the throne. Not Cyrus's son, simply a skilled liar. They debated their course of action, most favored caution and the gathering of troops, but Darius was adamant. Delay was fatal. They must act now before their plot was uncovered. His passion and determination convinced the others. 7 horsemen, 1 goal. Under cover of darkness, they arrived at the fortress where Gaumata was held. Taking advantage of their high position, they passed the guards and burst into the inner chambers. A brief, furious fight ensued. In the dim light of the chambers, amid shouts and the clash of metal, Darius and his comrades overtook the impostor. A spear thrust ended the greatest deception in Persian history. On September 29, 522 BC, the reign of the false Bardia ended, but as the blood cooled on the stone floor, the conspirators faced a new, even more terrifying reality. The impostor was dead, but the legitimate heir had also been dead for a long time. The scepter of Cyrus the Great lay on the floor, and no one had claimed it with undisputed right. The empire was left without a king. The blood had dried. The rebellions had been suppressed. The man who called himself Darius had seized power over the world. But to seize it was one thing, to hold it was quite another. Before him lay not a country, but a patchwork quilt of dozens of peoples, speaking hundreds of languages, praying to thousands of gods. Babylonians, Egyptians, Ionian Greeks, Bactrians, Indians. How could he make them all see themselves as part of a single whole? How could he transform the chaos of conquest into a structure capable of outliving its creator? Darius's answer was not shouted on the battlefield. It was carved in stone, minted in gold, and laid in the dust of the roads. The first order of business was to rewrite history, or rather, to create its official, only true version. For this, Darius chose neither parchment, which rots, nor a clay tablet, which crumbles. He chose eternity. In the Zagros Mountains, on the road from Babylon to Ecbatana, there is a sheer cliff, the Behistun Rock. 100 meters above the ground, where no human hand can reach, he ordered his stonemasons to perform a miracle. Year after year, under the scorching sun, they carved a gigantic panel from the limestone. There he is, Darius himself, as tall as a man, trampling the magician Gaumata, the usurper, underfoot. Behind the magician stand the shackled rebel kings, a rope binding their necks. And above them all hovers a winged disc, the symbol of the supreme god Ahura Mazda, who granted Darius the kingdom. But the image wasn't the point. The text was. The same story, the story of Darius's rise to power, was inscribed 3 times in the 3 main languages of the empire. Old Persian, the language of the victors; Elamite, the language of the ancient bureaucracy; and Akkadian, the language of Mesopotamia, spoken for centuries throughout Western Asia. It was a message that could not be burned or ignored. It was propaganda on a geological scale. To every passing caravan, every official, every soldier, the rock silently cried out, "I, Darius, King of Kings, rightful ruler by the will of Ahura Mazda. Anyone who rebels against me rebels against a god." But divine legitimacy alone wasn't enough. The empire needed a skeleton, a nervous system, and a bloodstream, and Darius gave it all of these. He divided the vast territories into 20 administrative provinces, which the Greeks would call satrapies. Each satrapy was a vast state within a state, with its own traditions and laws. At the head of each stood a satrap, a governor, often from the local nobility. He was granted enormous powers. He collected taxes, administered justice, and lived in luxury like a king. But his power was not absolute. This was the first ingenious system of checks and balances. The military garrison in the satrapy reported not to the satrap, but directly to Darius. The head of the treasury, who collected taxes, also reported only to the king. Thus, the satrap could not use either his army or his money to organize a rebellion. And above them all hovered an invisible shadow, a secret service known as the ears and eyes of the king. These were his personal inspectors who traveled the empire incognito, listening, watching, and reporting on everything. Disgruntled conversations in the marketplace, the excessive luxury of a satrap, the delay in paying taxes. Fear of an invisible spy was sometimes more effective than an entire legion. The empire was permeated with a network of invisible control. For this nervous system to function, it needed arteries, and Darius built them. He took the old Assyrian highways and transformed them into a marvel of engineering, the Royal Road. It stretched from the city of Sardis on the Aegean Sea to the capital, Susa, a distance of 2,700 kilometers. This was more than just a trail. Every 25 kilometers there was a post station with fresh horses and messengers. The royal courier, having received his orders in Susa, raced without rest. At the station, he transferred his saddlebag to a fresh horse and flew on. The historian Herodotus would later write that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor the darkness of night could slow these horsemen. The most important decree reached the farthest reaches of the empire in just 7 to 9 days, a speed unimaginable in the ancient world. Troops, officials, and merchants also traveled along this road. The empire shrank. Distances are no longer a death sentence, but what did these merchants carry? How did they pay their taxes? Darius realized that political unity was not enough. Economic unity was needed. He introduced the first single imperial currency in history, the gold darik, a coin weighing 8.4 grams of pure gold, bearing the image of the king himself as an archer. This was more than just a piece of metal. It was a guarantee of quality from the King of Kings himself. An Egyptian merchant could be sure that his darik would be accepted without question in Bactria. Trade flourished. Along with the darik, uniform measures of weight and volume were introduced. Now the empire spoke a single language, the language of money and standards. Finally, Darius decided to build a capital that would be the showcase of his empire. Not an administrative center like Susa, not an ancient metropolis like Babylon. He wanted to create a ceremonial center, a stage for displaying his greatness. In his native Persis, on an artificial terrace hovering above the plain, he began construction of the city the Greeks would call Persepolis. It was the construction of a century, reflecting the very essence of the empire. Cedar for the roofs was brought from Lebanon. Gold for the ornaments came from Sardis in Lydia. Turquoise from Khwarezm. Ivory from India. Craftsmen from all corners of the world flocked here. Babylonians fired bricks, Medes and Egyptians worked gold and silver, Ionian Greeks carved exquisite ornaments from stone. The construction process itself was a political act, a demonstration of unity in diversity. And on the walls of palaces and staircases, stonemasons carved what the world was destined to see. Endless processions, delegations of all 23 peoples of the empire, bowing to the King of Kings and bringing him gifts. Here are Lydians carrying elegant vases. Here are Armenians leading horses by the bridle. Here are Ethiopians with an elephant tusk and a giraffe. But there is no fear or humiliation in their faces. They are not slaves. They are participants in a great imperial project, each in their place, each contributing to the common prosperity under the wise hand of the ruler. It was an ideal picture of the world, carved in stone. A world where order has triumphed over chaos. Darius didn't just rule. He organized, he created systems. He transformed violence into order and conquest into a state. He wove his will into the fabric of history, using not only the sword, but also the stonemason's hammer, the merchant's scales, and the bureaucrat's pen. He created an empire that was no longer just a territory on a map, but a living, breathing organism, and this organism was carved in stone. Forever. At the turn of the 5th century BC, the world as people knew it belonged to a single man. The Achaemenid Empire, forged by the will of Cyrus and tempered by the campaigns of Darius the Great, stretched from the icy steppes of Scythia to the scorching sands of Nubia, from the shores of the Indus to the Aegean Sea. It was a mosaic of hundreds of peoples, speaking dozens of languages, but all paid tribute and bowed before a single throne in Susa. At the westernmost edge of this vast empire, where the Asian land met the sea, lay Ionia, the land of wealthy Greek cities, whose poets and philosophers taught the world how to think. Miletus, Ephesus, Phocia. Their inhabitants were Greeks by blood and language, but subjects of the Persian king by law. The empire governed them wisely and pragmatically. Instead of direct rule, the Persians installed local tyrants at the head of their cities, rulers whose power depended entirely on the favor of the imperial satrap, seated in glorious Sardis. The system worked for decades, but beneath the apparent calm, smoldering embers of pride, independence, and personal ambition, and it only took one desperate individual to fan these embers into an all-consuming flame. That man was Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus. He was neither a hero nor a freedom fighter. He was an adventurer, a gambler whose final bet proved too high. It all began not with a rebellion, but with an attempt to curry favor with Persia. Aristagoras promised Artaphernes, the brother of King Darius and satrap of Lydia, to conquer the rich island of Naxos for the empire. The plan was simple: a quick victory, glory, and untold riches. Artaphernes gave him 200 ships and the Persian general Megabates. But 2 ambitious men on one ship is a sure recipe for disaster. Aristagoras and Megabates had fallen out even before the expedition began. the insulted Persians secretly warned the inhabitants of Naxos of the impending attack. When the massive fleet approached the island, it was not frightened islanders who awaited them, but high walls and warriors ready for battle. 4 months of grueling and fruitless siege depleted the expedition's treasury. The ships returned to Miletus empty-handed. For Aristagoras, this was the end. He hadn't simply failed his mission. He had squandered the satrap's vast fortune and incurred the wrath of the most powerful man in Asia. A chasm yawned beneath his feet. Fearing for his life, cornered, he made the only move he could. He went all in. If he couldn't earn the king's forgiveness, he had to make sure the king had no interest in him. He decided to rouse all of Ionia to rebellion. It was a brilliant and cynical political move. Aristagoras publicly resigned as tyrant, proclaimed democracy in Miletus, and called on the other Ionian cities to follow his example and expel the Persian proxies. He turned his personal failure into a common cause of liberation. The idea of freedom, though born of fear, proved contagious. One after another, the Ionian cities overthrew their tyrants and joined the rebellion. The flames grew, but Aristagoras understood they could not stand alone against the might of the Persian Empire. He sailed to mainland Greece in search of allies. Sparta was the first. In the throne room, he unfolded a bronze map of the known world before King Cleomenes, showing the route deep into Asia and describing the fabulous riches of Susa. Cleomenes listened and asked a single question. How many days' journey from the sea to the Persian capital? 3 months, Aristagoras answered honestly. The Spartan's answer was short and cold, like the steel of his sword. He ordered the Ionian to leave Sparta before sunset. Sparta's laconic logic saw no point in waging a war 3 months' journey from home. Failure did not deter Aristagoras. He set off for Athens. Here, a different reception awaited him. The Athenians, who had recently thrown off tyranny themselves, sympathized with the Ionian Greeks. They saw them as brothers in blood and spirit. After heated debates in the popular assembly, a fateful decision was made. Athens would send 20 warships to aid the rebels. The small city of Eretria added 5 more. A total of 25 triremes, a mere drop in the ocean of Persian might. But, as the historian Herodotus later wrote, these ships marked the beginning of great troubles for the Greeks and barbarians. In the spring of 498 BC, the combined Greek fleet landed at Ephesus. The army, reinforced by Ionians, moved inland toward the heart of Persian power in the region, Sardis. They caught the city by surprise. The satrap Artaphernes and a small garrison had locked themselves in an impregnable fortress on the Acropolis, but the lower city was defenseless. The Greeks stormed its streets. One of the soldiers set fire to the outermost thatched house. A dry wind instantly spread the flames to the wooden buildings. The entire lower city, including the ancient temple of the local goddess Cybele, was transformed into a roaring inferno. This was more than just the burning of a city. It was sacrilege, an insult hurled in the face not only of the satrap but also of the gods of this land. When news of the burning of Sardis reached Darius in his palace in Susa, the King of Kings was furious. He didn't ask who the Ionians were. He knew his rebellious subjects. He asked another question, one that would change history. "And who are the Athenians?" he was told. And then, according to legend, Darius took his bow, shot an arrow into the sky, and said, "O supreme God, grant me vengeance on the Athenians." He ordered one of his servants to repeat the same phrase 3 times every day before every meal. "Lord, remember the Athenians." A personal debt, born from the ashes of a distant city, became state policy. This was no longer simply a punitive operation on the outskirts of the empire. It was the personal vendetta of the most powerful ruler on earth. The vast Persian military machine slowly but inexorably began to turn west. Its target was no longer rebellious Miletus. Its target was a small city across the sea that dared to send 20 ships, a city called Athens. Revenge is a dish best served not cold but with all-consuming fire, a fire that burned for 10 years in the heart of Xerxes, son of Darius. For 10 years he remembered his father's humiliation, the echo of shame that reached him from the fields of Marathon. And now, in 480 BC, Persia's response was ready. It was more than just an army. It was a continent in motion, an entire world torn from its place by the will of one man. Hundreds of thousands of warriors, the cream of dozens of nations, from Bactrian horsemen in leopard skins to Ethiopians with spears scorched by fire. Their march shook the earth. The dust from their sandals blotted out the sun. The target was Greece, Athens, Sparta, all those tiny, rebellious city-states that dared to challenge the ruler of Asia. But between the great king and his vengeance lay a barrier, not a wall, not an enemy army, a barrier created by the gods themselves, the Hellespont. A narrow strip of water where Europe almost touches Asia, where two seas meet, the eternally restless, capricious border of worlds. For ships, a passage. For a land army the size of an entire nation, an impassable barrier. Transporting such an army by ship would take months, if not years. It would be a logistical nightmare, the fragmentation of a great force. No, Xerxes thought differently. He didn't want to ask the sea for permission. He didn't want to sail across it. He decided to walk across it. The idea was unheard of in its audacity, to connect two continents with the will of a single man, to build a bridge across the sea. The empire's finest engineers, Phoenicians and Egyptians, arrived ashore. Their plan was brilliant in its simplicity and grandiose in its execution. Hundreds of ships, triremes and pentaconters, were to serve as floating supports. They were lined up side by side, bows upstream, held in place by the heaviest anchors. Then, monstrously thick ropes woven from papyrus and white linen were slung across them. Atop the ropes, a thick wooden plank was laid, covered with earth and compacted, turning it into a veritable road. High barriers were erected along the edges to prevent horses and pack animals from seeing the water and becoming frightened. It was a triumph of engineering. A road hovering above the waves, work was in full swing, the creaking of winches, the shouts of overseers, the pounding of thousands of hammers, all merged into a hymn to human will. And now the bridge was complete. Two continents, separated for centuries, were united. But the Hellespont, that ancient sea god, does not tolerate mortals playing its part. Before the Persians could celebrate their victory, the sky turned black. A storm blew in from the north. The wind howled like a wounded beast, raising waves to the heavens. The sea boiled. It tore and tossed the creation of men, tossing the enormous ships like splinters. Ropes capable of supporting the weight of an entire army snapped with a deafening crack. Anchors were torn from the seabed. In one night, only fragments remained of the greatest structure of the era, tossed by the waves onto the Asian shore, as if mocking the king's pride. The army looked on in superstitious horror. It was a sign from the gods, a sign that the campaign was doomed. Any other ruler would have retreated. But Xerxes had Achaemenid blood in his veins. He was more than just a king. He considered himself the scourge of the gods, the instrument of fate. And then Xerxes revealed his fury to the world, a fury that became legendary. He ordered the sea to be punished. Imagine this scene. The King of Kings stands on the shore, and his immortal guards enter the raging waves. At Xerxes' command, they begin to lash the water with whips, 300 blows. Each blow is a challenge to the elements, a challenge to Poseidon himself. The executioners plunge red-hot brands into the water, the hiss of the metal meeting the roar of the waves, and above it all, the voice of a herald rings out, pronouncing Xerxes' curse upon the sea. "O bitter water, our lord inflicts this punishment upon you because you have insulted him without suffering any offense from him. King Xerxes will cross you, whether you wish it or not. By right, no man offers sacrifice to you, for you are a muddy and salty stream." And then the king turned his wrath on the people. The engineers who built the first bridge were beheaded. This wasn't just a fit of madness, it was an act of absolute power, political theatre of incredible might. Xerxes demonstrated to his army, his enemies, and the gods themselves that his will knew no bounds. Not on land, not at sea. Anger gave way to cold calculation. New engineers arrived, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors. The second bridge was a masterpiece. More ships were used, 674. They were packed more closely together. The ropes were made even thicker and heavier, but most importantly, they changed the design itself. The Phoenicians wove their ropes from flax, while the Egyptians used papyrus. The flax ropes were stronger, but the papyrus ones were heavier. They were taut, with giant winches installed on the shore. To protect the structure from wind and current, a whole line of anchored breakwater ships was built in front of the bridge. The second bridge was wider, stronger, and more reliable. It was built not just with tenacity, but with intelligence born from disaster. And so the day of the crossing arrived. For 7 days and 7 nights, Asia flowed into Europe. It was a spectacle the world had never seen before. At dawn on the first day, Xerxes poured a libation into the sea from a golden cup, casting it into the waves along with a golden goblet and a Persian sword, a tribute and a final warning to the tamed elements. First across the bridge, strewn with myrtle branches, walked 10,000 immortals in their glittering armor, followed by the sacred cavalry, the chariots of the gods. Then came the endless river of people, the creaking of wood under the feet of hundreds of thousands of warriors, the neighing of horses, the rumble of carts, the multilingual hum. This symphony of invasion never ceased for a moment. Day and night, an endless stream of shields, spears, and banners. Xerxes himself sat on a marble throne set on a hill and watched. They say he wept, not from joy, but from the thought that in 100 years none of these mighty warriors will remain alive. When the last convoy left the Asian shore, the bridge across the Sea of the Gods remained standing. A scar on the face of the Hellespont, a monument to human will pushed to its limits. The army was in Europe. There was no turning back. Greece lay ahead. Thermopylae awaited. Imagine a continent stitched together by invisible threads. Not simply conquered, but organized, not simply subjugated, but governed. After the roar of battle died down and the dust settled on the fields from the Indus to the Aegean, the Persian Empire faced a task far more difficult than victory, the task of maintaining peace. The Achaemenid Empire wasn't just a territory, it was a system, a living, breathing organism whose health depended on the speed with which blood flowed through its arteries, and the royal road became its main artery. 2,699 kilometers of stone and compacted earth. From the administrative center in Susa to the westernmost border in Sardis. 90 days' journey for a simple caravan carrying Lydian gold or Babylonian textiles. But for the royal word, time flowed differently. Along the entire route, a day's ride away, there were stations. 111 stations, each with fresh horses and messengers ready to mount. This was the Angarian system, the nervous system of the empire. The royal decree, sealed in a leather tube, flew out of the capital and never paused. Messengers replaced one another, passing the message like a baton. Nothing in the world moved faster than these messengers, wrote one Greek historian, deeply moved. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness could slow their prescribed pace. An order to mobilize an army, a report of a conspiracy, a tax collection report. All of this reached its destination in 7, at most 9 days, a speed unimaginable in the ancient world, a speed that transformed disparate lands into a unified whole. The king in Persepolis knew about unrest in Egypt before anyone in the neighboring Egyptian city could. It was a power based on information. But roads are merely vessels. To control the gigantic body, a skeleton was needed, and Darius the Great, a brilliant administrator, created it. He divided the vast empire into 20 satrapies, each a former kingdom with its own traditions, languages and gods: Babylonia, Egypt, Bactria, Ionia. Darius didn't try to turn everyone into Persians. He acted wiser. He allowed them to remain themselves. At the head of each satrapy stood a satrap, a governor, often from the local nobility. He was a civil governor. His power was enormous but not absolute. Beside him stood a military commander who reported not to the satrap but directly to the king. And there was a third, the head of the treasury, who also reported only to the supreme authority. 3 men watching each other: the civil authority, the military, and the financial. They were forced to cooperate, but always remained rivals. And over them all hung the invisible shadow of the Secret Service. Thousands of agents known as the eyes and ears of the king traveled throughout the empire, collecting rumors, verifying reports, listening to whispers in markets and palaces. Any attempt at conspiracy or embezzlement became known in the capital almost instantly. It was a system of checks and balances honed to perfection. The empire was based not only on spears, but also on parchment with reports. And it all converged at one point, in the heart of the world, in a place that was not just a capital, but an idea embodied in stone: Persepolis. It took decades to build, 3 generations of kings pouring their souls and the treasures of their subject nations into it. It stood on a gigantic artificial terrace at the foot of a mountain, visible for dozens of kilometers. It was not a city for living, but a city for ceremonies, a declaration of power and order. Let's climb its grand staircase. The steps are gently sloping, allowing us to ascend them on horseback without dismounting. They lead us to the gate of all nations, guarded by gigantic winged bulls with human faces. Passing through, we find ourselves in a place where the very essence of the empire is frozen: the Apadana, the reception hall. Its Lebanese cedar roof was supported by 72 columns as tall as a 6-story building. But the main point isn't here. The main point is in the stone reliefs adorning the staircases leading to the hall. Here, in stone, is depicted an eternal parade. Delegations from all 23 nations subject to the King of Kings come to bring him gifts. Here come the Ethiopians leading a giraffe and carrying elephant tusks. Behind them, the Armenians with jugs of wine. Here are the Scythians in pointed caps leading a war horse. Here are the Babylonians with cups of pure gold. And here are the Lydians carrying precious vessels. Dozens of peoples, and look at their faces. There is no fear or humiliation in them. Their hands are unfettered. Their heads are held proudly. They are not slaves approaching a master. They are parts of a greater whole, arrived at the center of the universe to demonstrate their loyalty and receive in return a guarantee of peace and justice. Each bas-relief is an ethnographic reference, carved with incredible precision. The clothing, hairstyles, weapons, and gifts, everything is true. It was a message understood without words, in any language. A message that Persia is not tyranny, but order. Cosmos replacing chaos. Each people has its place in this universe, and above them all stands one figure, the King of Kings. He is the guarantor of this order. He is the heart that makes the entire system beat. Roads, satraps, spies, taxes, and finally, an ideology frozen in the stone of Persepolis. All of this was part of a single mechanism, the greatest administrative machine the ancient world had ever seen. The Achaemenid Empire learned to govern not just lands, but diversity. It created the first truly global power in history, where a decree issued in Persian was carried out a week later by a Greek in Asia Minor, a Jew in Palestine, and an Egyptian on the banks of the Nile. The pulse of this gigantic heart was felt everywhere. Walls lined with gold and lapis lazuli reflected the light of thousands of oil lamps, but they could not dispel the shadows gathering in the corners of the great palaces of Persepolis and Susa. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching from the Indus to the Danube, seemed an impenetrable rock. But the most terrible enemy lurked not at the borders. He lived within these walls. He wore expensive clothes, smiled at the king at banquets, and offered him a cup of wine. Power in Persia was absolute, and therefore the price for it was absolute. And it was paid not only in coins, it was paid in lives. The great Xerxes, the one who burned Athens and whose fleet blanketed the sea, was growing old. His energy was drained by harem intrigues and endless building projects. He became suspicious, weary, and vulnerable. And the one who should have been his main support became his executioner. Artabanus, commander of the royal guard, the man to whom the king entrusted his life every night. He didn't simply stand at the bedroom door, he entered it. In the year 465 BC, night fell on Persepolis. The palace's silence was broken not by a scream, but by its absence. Artabanus, accompanied by his eunuch valet, Aspamitres, entered the sleeping Xerxes' chambers. The sword that was meant to protect struck. The King of Kings, the ruler of Asia, was slain in his own bed, quietly and casually, like the slaughter of a sacrificial animal. But killing the king is only the first step. The true art of a conspirator is to survive and seize power, and Artabanus played his part brilliantly. He didn't declare himself king. Oh no, he ran to the chambers of Xerxes' youngest son, young Artaxerxes. Choking with feigned horror, he pointed to Artaxerxes' older brother, the crown prince Darius. "It's him!" Artabanus whispered, his words like poison injected directly into the grieving youth's ears. "He killed my father to seize the throne. He will kill you too." That night, the poison of lies proved more terrible than the poison in the cup. Blinded by grief and rage, the deceived Artaxerxes burst into his brother's chambers. Darius, not yet aware of his father's death, was killed by his own brother's hand. Artabanus stood by and watched, one son dead by his sword, another by his lies, the third his puppet. The throne was almost in his grasp, but poison has a way of cutting both ways. Megabyzus, the son-in-law of the murdered Xerxes and one of the most influential nobles, uncovered the plot. He came to the new, young king and revealed the murderer's true face. The final scene of this drama unfolded not in a dark corner, but in the throne room. Artabanus, realizing he had been exposed, attempted a last desperate effort to kill Artaxerxes as well. But the young king was quicker. The sword that had killed his father was stopped. The traitor fell at the foot of the throne he so coveted. Artaxerxes I ascended the throne, stepping over the bodies of his father and brother. The palace coup was complete, but it left behind an invisible legacy. Fear, paranoia became the very air breathed at court. Every cup of wine now seemed a threat. Every cook could be hired by the enemy. A complex system of tasters, sealed vessels, and personal servants emerged, who could only be trusted until the next sunrise. Trust, the fundamental pillar of any power, was poisoned. And this poison continued to circulate in the empire's veins for over 100 years. It accumulated, becoming ever more concentrated, until it gave birth to the most perfect monster of palace intrigue. His name was Baga. Bagoas was a eunuch. He had no claim to the throne, no power to found a dynasty. He had nothing but his wits, his ruthlessness, and his position at the side of King Artaxerxes III, nicknamed Ochus. Together they carried out a bloody purge, slaughtering dozens of princes and potential claimants. Bagoas was the king's shadow, his secret sword and apothecary. He brought Ochus to absolute power, and then he decided the king had become too independent. In 338 BC, Artaxerxes III, one of the last great and cruel rulers of Persia, died suddenly. No official cause was given. But the entire court knew Bagoas had grown tired of his master. He not only poisoned the king, but according to some sources, fed his body to cats and ordered his thigh bones to be made into sword hilt. This was more than just a reprisal. It was a ritual of total humiliation. Bagoas placed Ochus's youngest son, Arses, on the throne. An obedient youth, a puppet. But even puppets sometimes show signs of pride. When Arses attempted to rid himself of his all-powerful patron, Bagoas acted preemptively. He poisoned the new king, and then all his children, so that not a single direct heir remained. He uprooted the entire dynasty. Now Bagoas needed a new king, and he chose one from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid line, a prince named Darius. He seemed the ideal candidate, noble but without real power. Bagoas placed him on the throne expecting eternal gratitude and obedience, but he underestimated Darius III. The new king knew who he was dealing with. Rumors, denunciations, warnings. The palace buzzed like a disturbed beehive. And then came the moment of truth. At one of the banquets, Bagoas, following his usual routine, offered the king a goblet of poisoned wine. Perhaps it was a test of loyalty. Perhaps he had already decided that this king too was not right for him. He approached with a smile, like a loyal servant. But he saw no fear in Darius's eyes. He saw knowledge. Darius III took the cup. He looked at Bagoas. And then, calmly and authoritatively, he ordered him to drink for himself. "Drink to the health of your king," he may have said. All the cunning, all the plots, all the web of intrigue that Bagoas had woven over decades collapsed in an instant. He had fallen into his own trap. Before the eyes of the entire court, the greatest poisoner in Persian history drained the cup of his own poison. Thus ended the era of palace poisons. But it was too late. The empire, corroded from within by decades of betrayal, murder, and paranoia, was weak. Its veins were filled not with living blood, but with the slow poison of mistrust. And in the west, a storm was already gathering. A young Macedonian king named Alexander was preparing his army. He was not simply going to conquer lands. He was going to finish off the colossus that had already poisoned itself. In 336 BC, while the shadow of the poisoned dagger still hovered over the palaces of Persepolis, a man ascended the throne whose fate was destined to be unenviable. His name was Artashat, but he would go down in history under the name Darius, the third Darius. He was not a direct descendant of the great kings, but rather a distant relative raised to power by palace intrigue and murder. Achaemenid blood flowed in his veins, but the empire he assumed was no longer the invincible force forged by Cyrus and his namesake Darius the Great. It was a colossus with a heart of gold and feet of clay. Vast, unimaginably rich, but slow-moving and plagued by internal strife. Satraps in distant provinces ruled as independent kings, and Greek mercenaries formed the backbone of the army, fighting for Persian gold against their own compatriots. Darius was a brave warrior, and perhaps could have been a good ruler in peacetime. But peacetime was not his. To the west, beyond the Aegean Sea, the dawn of a new era was breaking. A young Macedonian king named Alexander, son of Philip II, had just unified Greece with fire and sword. Now his gaze, filled with an insatiable thirst for glory, turned east. In 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont. With him was an army insignificant compared to the innumerable armies of Persia, some 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. But this was more than just an army. It was a deadly machine, honed over generations of warfare, driven by genius. The first encounter took place on the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, confident of their superiority, occupied a vantage point on the high bank. They laughed at the Macedonians' audacity. Their commander, the Greek mercenary Memnon of Rhodes, begged them not to engage, but to retreat, scorching the land and depriving the enemy of provisions. They ignored him. The Persian nobility thirsted for glory. Alexander, defying all military wisdom, personally led his cavalry in a frontal assault across the river amid a hail of arrows and javelins. He cut his teeth in the thick of the battle, his helmet shattered, his life hanging by a thread. This onslaught, this fury of a young king fighting like a simple warrior, stunned the Persians. Their line was shattered. Asia Minor, the jewel of the empire, was lost in one brief, bloody clash. News of the defeat reached Darius. He realized the scale of the threat. Now he would lead the army himself. He would gather forces the likes of which the world had never seen. A year later, in 333 BC, the two armies met again, on the narrow coastal plain near the city of Issus. Darius brought with him, according to various estimates, at least 100,000 warriors. With him were his entire court, his harem, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his children. He rode into battle on a colossal war chariot, trimmed with gold and ivory, confident that the mere sight of his royal majesty would put the enemy to flight. But he made a fatal mistake. The narrow battlefield deprived him of his greatest advantage, numerical superiority. His massive army could not deploy. Alexander once again saw his target, not the Persian flanks, not the center. The target was Darius himself. The Macedonian cavalry, the companions, slammed into the Persian ranks like a wedge, cutting a bloody corridor straight to the royal chariot. The battle raged around Darius. His immortal bodyguards fell one after another, defending their master. For a moment, the two kings' gazes met through the dust and clanging of steel. Alexander saw before him not a symbol of power, but only a mortal man. Darius saw inexorable fate in the Macedonian's eyes, and his nerve gave way. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, abandoning his army, his banner, his family. The army, seeing the king flee, disintegrated into an unruly mob. Alexander's victory was complete. The entire Persian camp, countless treasures, and, most importantly, the family of the King of Kings fell into his hands. From his refuge, the humiliated Darius sent Alexander a letter. He offered peace. He offered a huge ransom for his family, all the lands west of the Euphrates, and his daughter's hand in marriage. In effect, he offered to divide the world. Alexander's wise and elderly general Parmenion told his king, "If I were Alexander, I would accept this offer." To which Alexander responded with a phrase that has gone down in history: "I would too if I were Parmenion." He didn't want half the empire, he wanted it all. The final gamble was made 2 years later, in 331 BC, on a vast plain near the village of Gaugamela, not far from the ruins of ancient Nineveh. This time, Darius was prepared. He chose the perfect spot, ordering the ground leveled for his sickle-axle-mounted war chariots. He assembled an army superior to anything he had ever seen: elephants from India, cavalry from Bactria and Scythia, infantry from all corners of his vast empire. Dust raised by hundreds of thousands of feet and hooves obscured the midday sun, turning the day into a crimson twilight. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of this army. Alexander employed a brilliant and risky maneuver. He moved his right wing not forward, but at an angle to the right, stretching the Persian front. Darius, fearing encirclement, sent his best cavalry in pursuit. A gap opened in the Persian line. And into this very gap, into this breach, Alexander, at the head of his hetairoi, struck. As at Issus, his target was one man. Again a desperate dash for the royal chariot. And again Darius could not resist. For the third time, the King of Kings turned his back on his army. His flight became the signal for general defeat. The Battle of Gaugamela devolved into a massacre. The Achaemenid Empire, which had stood for over 200 years, collapsed in a single day. Babylon and Susa opened their gates without a fight. Persepolis, the heart of the empire, was sacked and burned. Darius himself became a fugitive within his own country. His satraps no longer obeyed him, and his former allies turned against him. He raced east to the distant provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, hoping to raise a new army. But his time was up. His own satrap, Bessus, decided that a living, unsuccessful king was a nuisance. Together with other conspirators, he captured Darius. As the Macedonian vanguard was catching up, the conspirators stabbed the king several times with spears and abandoned him to die in a cart on the side of a dusty road. A Macedonian soldier found him still alive. The last King of Kings, ruler of a quarter of humanity, begged for a sip of water. When Alexander arrived, Darius III was already dead. Legend has it that Alexander, upon seeing the body of his fallen enemy, removed his cloak and covered it, the gesture of a victor who now laid claim not only to the lands, but also to the legacy of a fallen dynasty. The Achaemenid era was over, ended not in the glory of a great battle, but in dust, blood, and betrayal on a forgotten road, somewhere on the outskirts of a collapsed world. A new era was beginning, the era of Hellenism. It seemed the Achaemenid Empire would last forever. For 2 centuries, its shadow covered the world from the Aegean Sea to the banks of the Indus. Its roads, paved by the will of kings, connected dozens of peoples. Its treasuries groaned with the gold of conquered kingdoms. Persia was more than just a state, it was the world order itself, as immutable as the Zagros Mountains. But to the west, in the restless shadow of Macedonia, a storm was brewing. His name was Alexander. In the spring of 334 BC, this storm swept across Asia. King Philip's son, a 22-year-old youth, led an army that seemed like a speck of dust compared to the might of the Persians. Just over 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Greeks and Macedonians, seasoned in internecine wars, united by a vow to avenge the burning of Athens by Xerxes. This was the official pretext. But the true goal burned in the eyes of their king, not revenge, but conquest. The entire world. The first blow thundered on the banks of the Granicus River. The Persian satraps, confident in their strength and superiority, deployed their cavalry right at the water's edge on the steep bank. The trap seemed obvious. Any sensible commander would have begun with a maneuver, but Alexander was not sensible. He was a genius of daring. He did not hesitate. He threw his elite cavalry, the companions, forward, straight across the river, straight into a wall of spears. What followed was less a battle than a bloody melee. Macedonian sarisi, the long spears of the phalanx, swept Persian horsemen from their saddles. Alexander himself, visible by the plume on his helmet, was cutting through the thick of the fray. One blow from a Persian sword split his helmet, another was raised for a fatal thrust, but was parried by the spear of Clytus the Black, who saved the king's life. The satraps wavered and fled. The Greek mercenaries serving the Persians were surrounded and slaughtered almost to a man. Asia felt the cold of Macedonian steel for the first time. The way into the interior of the continent was open. The cities of Asia Minor surrendered one after another. In Phrygia, in the city of Gordium, Alexander was shown an ancient relic, a chariot whose knot was so intricately tied that no one could untie it. An oracle declared that whoever could untie it would become the ruler of Asia. Alexander looked at the knot. He didn't bother to look for the beginning or end of the thread. He simply drew his sword and cut it with a single blow. This was how he solved all problems, not by the rules but directly with willpower and the sharpness of his blade. News of the defeat at the Granicus and the fall of the cities reached the King of Kings, Darius III. He could no longer rely on his satraps. He assembled a massive army, hundreds of thousands of warriors from all corners of the empire, Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Indians. An endless stream of men and bronze, stretching to the horizon, moved to meet the invader. They met in the autumn of 333 BC near the city of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain sandwiched between mountains and the sea. Darius had chosen this location himself, and it proved his fatal mistake. On this patch of land, his numerical superiority was irrelevant. The armies stood face to face. At the center of the Persian line, in a gleaming chariot, surrounded by 10,000 immortals, stood Darius himself. Once again, Alexander did the impossible. He led his cavalry in a desperate suicidal charge, but not on the flank, as tactics dictated, but straight into the center. Cutting a bloody corridor through the ranks of the Persian nobility, he raced toward one goal: Darius's chariot. The King of Kings saw the spears rushing toward him and the wild eyes of the Macedonian king. And he broke. Darius turned his chariot around and fled the battlefield. His army saw his flight, and what had been an army turned into a panicked mob. The Macedonian victory was complete. The entire Persian camp, the treasury, and most importantly, Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children, fell into Alexander's hands. He treated them with royal magnanimity, astonishing both enemies and allies, but he refused the fleeing Darius's peace proposals. He didn't want a piece of the empire. He wanted the whole empire. For the next 2 years, he did not pursue Darius. He methodically, like a stonemason, chipped away at Persia piece by piece. He besieged and captured impregnable coastal cities like Tyre, depriving the Persians of their navy. He entered Egypt as a liberator and was proclaimed pharaoh, the son of the god Amun. Near the Nile Delta, he founded a city that would forever bear his name, Alexandria. Meanwhile, Darius was gathering his last strength. He had learned the lessons of his defeat at Issus. For the decisive battle, he chose a place where his army could deploy its full, gigantic might, a vast sea-like plain near the village of Gaugamela. On October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies clashed in their final battle. The Persian army was unimaginably large: war elephants, chariots with scythes on their wheels, cavalry from the endless steppes. Dust raised by hundreds of thousands of feet and hooves obscured the sun. Alexander again employed the tactics that had become part of every textbook. He advanced his troops not directly, but diagonally, shifting the flank and stretching the Persian front. Darius launched his formidable chariots into the attack, but the Macedonian infantry simply parted, letting them through into the depths of the line, where they were slaughtered. A gap opened in the Persian line, attempting to envelop the Macedonians. And into this gap, like a spear, Alexander again struck with his cavalry. And once again, his target was a single man. He made his way to the center. Darius saw him. For the second time in his life, he saw his destiny face before him. And for the second time, he ran. After this, the battle turned into a massacre. The Persian armies ceased to exist. The Achaemenid dynasty, which had ruled the world for 220 years, was crushed in the dust of a single plain. The way to Babylon, Susa, and the fabulously rich Persepolis was open. The storm from the west had not simply passed over Persia, it had torn its crown from its feet. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great's army, intoxicated by its victory at Gaugamela, crossed the Zagros Mountains. Before them, on a vast plain, lay what was neither a fortress nor a military camp. It was the stone heart of the empire, Parsa. The Greeks would call it Persepolis, city of the Persians. This wasn't a city as we know it, it was a gigantic palace complex, a ceremonial capital built to inspire awe. Generations of kings from Darius the Great to Artaxerxes III had poured the wealth of all of Asia into it. A vast terrace soaring above the plain, stairs so wide that 10 horsemen abreast could ascend them, the gate of all nations guarded by colossal winged bulls with human heads, through which delegations passed from Ethiopia to India. And above it all, the palaces, the Apadana, the audience hall, whose ceiling of Lebanese cedar was supported by 72 20-meter-high columns. The hall of 100 columns, Xerxes' throne room, could accommodate 10,000 people. The Macedonians entered the city without a fight. The garrison surrendered, and what they saw surpassed all rumors. This wasn't just wealth, it was the very idea of empire embodied in gold, stone, and wood. Plutarch and Diodorus write that the Persepolis treasury held 120,000 talents of silver and gold. To grasp the scale, 1 talent is more than 25 kilograms of precious metal. It took thousands of mules and camels just to transport this loot. Soldiers plundered private homes, tearing precious jewelry from the walls and smashing ivory-inlaid furniture. For several months, the army lived in this captured paradise, wallowing in luxury and wine. Alexander stood at a crossroads. What to do with this symbol? To destroy it would be to become like the barbarians. To leave it would mean preserving a monument to the greatness of the dynasty he had just overthrown. The decision did not come in the quiet of a strategist's office. It was born in the fires of a banquet. One night, a magnificent banquet was held in Xerxes' palace. Wine flowed freely, music thundered. Warriors and generals, weary from campaigns, celebrated their final victory. Among the guests was the Athenian courtesan Thais, lover of the general Ptolemy, the future king of Egypt. Ancient authors recount that in the midst of drunken revelry, when reason gave way to passion, Thais delivered a speech. She said that the greatest pleasure for her, an Athenian, would be to walk with a torch through this accursed palace and, with her own hands, set fire to the chambers of the king who had burned her hometown, to avenge the destroyed Acropolis, for the burned temple of Athena. Her words fell on fertile ground. Drunken shouts of approval took up the idea. Someone shouted that only Alexander was worthy of leading this march of vengeance. The idea, born of wine, grew into an unstoppable impulse. Alexander himself, young, hot-blooded, perhaps a little too drunk, succumbed to the mood. He leapt from the table, wreath on his head and torch in hand, and led the noisy procession. They walked through the dark halls where not long ago the fate of the world had been decided. Torches lit up the gloom, revealing reliefs depicting the majesty of the Persian kings. The first, they say, to throw her torch was the Athenian courtesan Thais, straight into the chambers of Xerxes. The same Xerxes who had ordered the burning of Athens 150 years earlier. And after her, Alexander himself. The dried Lebanese cedarwood, soaked in oils, burst into flames instantly. Flames leaped up to the carved ceilings. Tapestries and carpets collected from across the empire became fuel for the flames. The wooden beams of the colonnades cracked and collapsed, dragging tons of stone blocks with them. Gold and silver plates on the walls melted, flowing down the bas-reliefs in streams of precious metal. What had taken decades to build was doomed in a single night. The fire was so intense that the limestone walls of the palaces were forever discolored, and the stone cracked from the unbearable heat. When the morning sun illuminated the smoking ruins, the drunken stupor subsided. Alexander, as historians write, regretted his actions. He saw what he had done. He had destroyed more than just an enemy capital. He had burned a work of art, a wonder of the world, which was now rightfully his. This was not the gesture of a liberating king, but the act of a vandal. A symbolic act of revenge resulted in an irreparable loss for the entire world. Persepolis was never rebuilt. Its charred columns and molten stones remained standing beneath the Persian sky as an eternal monument. A monument not only to the former greatness of the Achaemenids, but also to that terrible night when one man, standing at the pinnacle of the world, gave in to his rage and burned the heart of his new empire. The ashes of Persepolis became the funeral pyre for the great Persian Empire, and the smoke from that pyre forever changed history. When the last hall of Persepolis burned out, when the smoke cleared from the ruins, revealing blackened columns reaching into the silent sky, it might have seemed all was over. In 330 BCE, the Macedonian phalanx crushed the Colossus. The Achaemenid Empire, stretching across 3 continents, the first true superpower in human history, ceased to exist. The greatest political project of antiquity, which had lasted for 220 years, was consigned to flames and oblivion. The empire was dead, but the death of a political body is not the end of history, but merely the rebirth of its ideas in new, sometimes unrecognizable forms. The ghost of Persia did not leave this world with the last Darius. It remained. It wove itself into the very fabric of subsequent eras, becoming an immortal echo that resounds to this day. Listen. At first, we hear echoes in stone and dust. Alexander the Conqueror became the reluctant heir. He retained the Persian system of satrapies because he could devise nothing more effective for governing vast territories. His generals, the Diadochi, divided the spoils and founded their Hellenistic kingdoms on Persian foundations. The Seleucids, who ruled the heart of the former empire, minted coins, collected taxes, and administered the provinces according to the templates established under Cyrus and Darius. The administrative DNA of the empire outlived its creators. And the roads. The Great Royal Road, stretching 2,500 kilometers from Susa to Sardis, was not overgrown with grass. Its polished stones, continued to serve. Seleucid couriers galloped along them, as did Parthian legions and later Romans on the eastern borders. These arteries, laid out by Persian engineers, continued to flow not only troops but also goods, ideas, and cultures for hundreds of years. Silk from China met Mediterranean glass in the markets that sprang up along the Persian highway. The echo of Persia resounded in the creaking wheels of merchant caravans. But there is an echo far deeper than roads and provincial borders. It is the echo of ideas. At the very heart of Persian thought lay the teachings of the prophet Zoroaster. Zoroastrianism, with its eternal struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. With its belief in the one wise God, Ahura Mazda, in the coming Saviour, in the final judgment and the resurrection of the dead. These concepts, born in the Iranian steppes, were not confined within the borders of the empire. Through the Babylonian exile of the Jews, through cultural exchange in Asia Minor, they permeated the beliefs of their neighbors. Ideas of heaven and hell, angels and demons, of the decisive final battle between the forces of truth and falsehood. They set out on a long journey, leaving an indelible mark on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Billions of people today, without knowing it, preserve in their sacred texts echoes of the whispers of priests at the eternal fire, and the very concept of empire. Before Cyrus the Great, the world knew only brutal conquerors who razed cities to the ground and carried peoples off into slavery. The Persians offered something different. The Cyrus cylinder, found in the ruins of Babylon, proclaims not only victory but also mercy, the return of exiled peoples to their homelands, the restoration of their sanctuaries, respect for local customs. It was a revolution. The idea of a multinational, tolerant empire, united not only by force of arms but also by a common system of laws, roads, and justice, became a model. Rome, in building its empire, largely, consciously or not, followed this path. The idea that different peoples can coexist under a single, just law is also an immortal echo of Persia. But echoes can also be paradoxical. The greatest enemy often becomes your greatest co-author. For ancient Greece, Persia became the other in confrontation with which Hellenic, and then all Western, identity was born and forged. In the flames of the Battle of Marathon, in the gorge of Thermopylae, in the roar of the triremes at Salamis, the Greeks recognized themselves as a single whole. Aeschylus wrote his Persians, creating an image of an enemy, effeminate, despotic, barbaric. Herodotus, the father of history, made the Greco-Persian Wars the central plot of his work, establishing the dichotomy of free West versus despotic East as the foundation of European thought. This framework, this optic, born 2,500 years ago, has proven incredibly resilient. For centuries, the West defined itself by looking into a mirror that reflected the image of Persia it had created. The empire perished, but the Persian spirit was unbroken. 5 centuries after Alexander, when Hellenic power weakened, a new power arose on the Iranian plateau, the Sassanids. And they didn't consider themselves new rulers. They proclaimed themselves the legitimate heirs of the Achaemenids. They restored the title of Shahanshah, King of Kings. They revived Zoroastrianism as the state religion. They gazed upon the reliefs at Naqsh-e-Rustam, where Darius and Xerxes were buried, and carved their own alongside them, linking themselves with an unbreakable thread to their great past. The dream of Persian glory did not die in the fires of Persepolis. It merely smouldered beneath the ashes, only to be rekindled. For another 400 years, Sassanid Iran would be the main rival of Rome and then Byzantium, proving that an echo can take on flesh and blood. The Achaemenid Empire disappeared from the political map, Its cities became archaeological sites, its language was silenced, but its legacy dissolved into the global ocean of history, changing its chemical composition forever. It resides in our notions of good and evil, in the structure of modern states, in the roots of transport corridors, in our very division of the world into East and West. The immortal echo of Persia doesn't need to be sought in museum halls beneath the cold gleam of glass. It's everywhere. It doesn't shout from the podium. It whispers within the very fabric of our civilization, and this whisper is immortal.